What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero back with another fiber format video. I know it's been a while since I made my last one since I was on a vacation, but this should be a pretty fun one to return to, as this is a deck that is just trying to go for the most degenerate combo that you can pull off in this format, which is the Yata lock. And now a good stuff deck can pull off the Yata lock. I mean, I showed that in my previous video discussing the good stuff decks in this format, but there are other ways to go about it, just trying to deprive your opponent of as many resources in the hand as possible and opening up the way for your Yata Garasu to get in. This becomes a much more common strategy in later formats with more powerful hand disruption cards released, but there is the potential to do this in this format as well, specifically with cards like Drop Off. Now, Drop Off is a normal trap card that says when your opponent draws for their normal draw in their draw phase, your opponent discards one card they just drew. Now, this is nice and actually a strict improvement over a previous card here, which is Time Seal. Or I guess not a strict improvement, as there are things that can make this go wrong. For instance, if your opponent draws a Sinister Serpent, and you activate Drop Off, they'll be able to get back that Sinister Serpent, which is very unfortunate. But mostly, Drop Off is an improvement over the Time Seal, as Time Seal is a normal trap that says skip the draw phase of your opponent's next turn. So you can't actually use this to deprive your opponent of advantage right away the turn after it's set. You need to wait another turn. Drop Off, on the other hand, can be activated the turn after it's set, deprive your opponent of advantage, and be pretty decent. So we're basically playing a deck trying to take advantage of these normal traps. We could be playing also something like Mask of Darkness to recycle these traps, but I feel like that's a bit too slow, and we want to just sort of get aggressive, force our opponent to use up what little resources they have, and then bring out Yata later for the Yata lock. Now, I haven't been the biggest fan of hand control decks in the past because I feel like they're a little bit win more, but in the format with Yata here, I do think that it does become a much more viable strategy, as if you're able to pull off the Yata lock pretty consistently and shut your opponent off of getting new resources, then depriving them of a ton of resources becomes a lot better, and isn't just sort of a temporary stopgap that your opponent is eventually able to claw their way out of. But let's dive into the card by card of this list now, as I did make some kind of interesting choices here. I think I probably would switch some things up if I, sort of revisit this deck in the future, but this was my initial take on it. Now, the main goal of this deck is to be very controlling and deprive your opponent of resources, so for that reason, I didn't actually include a Fiber Jar in the main deck. I just wanted to experiment with taking this card out, as this card can be good for like sort of comeback possibilities, but it also does reset all the progress that you've made on getting rid of your opponent's resources. So I'm not really sure it's the best in this sort of deck, in the main deck at least. You can potentially bring it in for tough matches if you are worried that you're going to get down pretty quickly. You'll note that we're also not being as aggressive as many other decks are. So we don't have things like Injection Fairy Lily, which can be a very good offensive threat in this format. We're trying to go all in on control, not aggression, because if we can get our opponent to a point where they do have no resources and we've got Yata on field, we win anyways. So we don't really need to play a card that costs us a ton of life points while also dealing a bunch to our opponent, or at least that's the theory behind it. I think if you were trying to make this deck a little bit better, Injection Fairy Lily wouldn't be a bad card to add. But I wanted to go all in on the shtick and see how it did. You'll notice for the beating triangle, we also aren't playing 2 copies of Bazoo, just playing 1 copy. 2 copies of Kaiku and Gemini Alphas. They're pretty good, and Kaiku can banish cards from the graveyard after we've sort of hit them with things like Drop Off. So I do think that is pretty valuable here. But again, since we're not going full aggression, I do think the Bazoo can be a good option here. Although I will say that, in playing the games a bit, I think adding a second Bazoo might be good, especially over something like a White Magical Hat, as I think White Magical Hat is just, really underpowered in this format. And while it can be useful for your hand control strategy, I found myself very underwhelmed with this card in general here. The rest of the monster lineup is pretty standard. I will say one interesting thing is that we are playing 2 Magician of Faith. The idea behind this is to recycle your hand rip cards like Confiscation, Delinquent Duo, and Forceful Sentry. But I do think that this might be a bit too slow, and I might potentially take it out in the future, or at least reduce it down to 1 copy. But it's something to consider in this deck, I think. For the other monsters, as I said, they're pretty typical. We've got an Exiled Force, a Jinzo, 3 Mystic Tomatoes, a Witch of the Black Force, and a Sangan to round up the lineup. For these spells, again, it's pretty typical here. We've got a Change of Heart, Confiscation, Dark Hole, Delinquent Duo, 2 Graceful Charity, 1 Harpy's Feather Duster, 1 Monster Reborn, 3 Mystical Space Typhoon, a Painful Choice, a Pot of Greed, a Raigeki, a Snatch Steal, and a Forceful Sentry. The trap lineup is where things get a bit more interesting. We've got the typical traps in the form of Call of the Haunted, Imperial Order, and Mirror Force, but as I mentioned before, we've also got 3 3 drop off. And we are indeed playing 2 time seal, even though drop off is a strict improvement over time seal. We just wanted to deprive our opponent of as many resources as possible to try and set up the Yata lock. I think maybe you could play around with these ratios in the future, like maybe you don't need 2 time seal here in addition to the 3 drop off, but you'll see in the games how that actually turned out. For the side deck, it's a pretty typical side. I mean, I was trying to just put in some cards to potentially experiment with adding, so that's like why I got the Fiber Jar in here and why I've got the Sinister Serpent. We're not playing Sinister Serpent in the main deck as it doesn't really do anything to advance our strategy, but it could potentially be a good card to include in the future. We're also playing the second Bazoo here to potentially bring in if we want more aggressive pressure. We've got a Heavy Storm from our back row focus deck, Nobleman's of Crossouts for more flip focus decks, although playing some games, I think maybe this would be good to bring in, like maybe into the main deck, or just in general when you're going second, as being able to clear your opponent's monster and then get in with something like Yata can be very, very nice. We've also got a Scapegoat to help against aggressive decks. We've got a Ceasefire against flip focus decks. We've got 3 Jar of Greed just to try them out here. We've got a 3rd Time Seal in case we do want the additional sort of hand disruption. And we've also got 3 Torrential Tribute in case we do want more defensive traps in our lineup. The Fusion deck doesn't really have anything interesting. I should really update this for the new Fusion monsters released in LOD. But I mean, we're never going into this, so it doesn't really matter in the first place. But now that I've talked about this deck and the reasons why I built it the way I did, let's dive into some games and see how this actually does in a match. Okay, we've got a game against Big Rags 219, who is a new guest on the channel. Always happy to have a new player on. And we unfortunately do lose the rock, paper, scissors here, so they will be able to go first. And that's a shame because this is a pretty good hand. We had the Time Seal to disrupt their play. We got Pot of Greed here to draw a bit, so we just gotta hope that they don't have like Confiscation or a Forceful Sentry to send back that Pot of Greed. The good thing is that Harpy's Feather Duster could be valuable here if they do set a bunch here. But it looks like they're not going to do that. They're just going to go for this painful choice here. Sending 5 good ones. They sent a Forceful Sentry and a Confiscation, but no Duo. So they could potentially not be playing Duo, as I do think that Duo isn't necessarily a must-include in this format in the Good Stuff decks, or they could already have it. But I do think that the choice here is probably just to give them Serpent. We don't have any way to get it out of their graveyard as of yet. So it's probably just best to give them the Serpent. Nobleman of Crossout doesn't really matter against our current hand, but it could come up later. And we don't want to give them the Mystic Tomato, as that is a pretty good monster to bring out. So we'll give them the Serpent. They'll add that to hand. And they're just going to set 2 and pass back to us. We draw Mystical Space Typhoon, which is really good, as that does insulate a potential Imperial Order counter on the form of Big Rax's part. But luckily that does go through, and we do draw Yata, which is pretty nice. We can get the lockup potentially in the coming turns. We're going to attack into their set with Gemini Elf. Unfortunately, it is Witch, so they'll be able to search out a Bazoo. But our Kaiku can potentially deal with that in a couple turns, so it's not the worst. We'll set a Time Seal here, and we'll set a Mystical Space Typhoon, pass back to them. This is playing a bit into Harpy's Feather Duster, but if they do use Harpy's Feather Duster, we can chain the Time Seal. And we don't want them to end phase blind MST our set, so I think that this is fine. We're going to pass back to them. They're going to just summon out an Exiled Force and treat it off to deal with the Gemini Elf. I think probably they maybe should have gone for the Bazoo, but I do get this play if they're worried about something like Trap Hole, which can deal with their monster. They just want to clear ours in case we don't have much more aggressive pressure. So that will indeed go through. They're going to set another, pass back to us. And I feel like this could be a good time to just go for the Harpies here. Maybe set up the Yata lock. Looks like they've got a Call of the Haunted here, and they're going to attempt to bring back this Witch. And we actually do the thinking face when they do the Call of the Haunted. But they activate the Mystical Space Typhoon immediately, targeting our Mystical Space Typhoon. So, I mean, well, I guess we're going to chain Mystical Space Typhoon to their Mystical Space Typhoon. And this will prevent the Witch from hitting the field here. So yeah, I mean, this is just a good reason to always hold on to your cards until you see what your opponent's going to do. If your opponent does fire the thinking phase, do give them time to actually think about it, and don't just, fire your other cards. That did work out pretty well for us here. I mean, if it didn't, I mean, they would have chained MST and hit our, Time Seal, which we would have chained. So it ultimately would have been fine and not really affected things here. It's just good to know in the future. I'm actually, instead of going for the Yata lock, I'm going to bring out this Kaiku and attack in, because we do have the Time Seal to prevent them from drawing a card next turn anyways. And this can clear some good cards from their graveyard. So, yeah. They are going to go into their turn, and they're going to attempt to bring up Bazoo, but Bazoo does not get over Kaiku, so They're actually going to mix this up a bit. They're going to bring out an Injection Fairy Lily here and attack in. So they'll pay 2,000. We take 1,600, and that Injection Fairy Lily will get over our Kaiku here. Now, I go for a bit of a greedy play here. I summon out Mystic Tomato, and I start hitting into this Injection Fairy Lily. The reason for this is if they do pay the 2,000, we take 2,000 as well, and then we can attack in with another Mystic Tomato, potentially cause them to take another 2,000, and then they're at very low life points. We're also at pretty low life points, but we can just kill them at that point. So they can't pay for Injection Fairy Lily twice. So I think it is fine. However, if they do pay for it once, then we are going to be at a pretty low life point total. So it is a little bit risky. But I do think it's a risk worth taking. They're not going to actually pay for the Lily here, which I do think makes a lot of sense, as they don't want to drop down super low. We're just going to set this drop off and pass back to them. They're going to draw. We can fire this drop off without fear, given that we do know that they've got Serpent already in hand. They'll send a Kaiku to grave. They're going to bring out this Bazoo here, banish 3, and then they'll attack into our Tomato here. We'll take a whopping 1,100, and we'll be able to bring out a Witch of the Black Forest here. And we draw a Call of the Haunted, which isn't the best, but it also isn't the worst. So we'll just set the Call of the Haunted, pass back to them. And the Bazoo will sort of drop down to his own attack, but Big Racks will indeed pay for that to buff it up a bit more. They're going to set one in face down defense and attack in to this Witch of the Black Forest. And we're going to actually add an Exiled Forest to hand. This will be able to deal with the Bazoo here in one turn, and we do have the call to recycle the Exiled Forest for later. So I feel like it's pretty good. We check their graveyard and see that they don't have any spells, so if their set is something like a Magician of Faith, then we can get over it with the Exiled Force. We also know that they've used up a Witch, so it can't be Witch. It could be Tomato potentially, but if we attack into a Tomato with Exiled Force, then, you know, we only take 100 and we at least get more information that way. So I do think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to think about it a bit, and since there aren't too many punishes, I'm just going to attack into their set. If they are playing Masked Sorcerer or something, then we get majorly punished here, but no one really is playing Masked Sorcerer in this format, as it's just sort of past its prime. So we're going to hit over that Magician of Faith, and they didn't have any spells, so that worked out well for us. And then we're going to tribute off the Exiled Force to deal with the Bazoo there. Our opponent's going to bring out a Gemini Elf and hit in for 1,900. Now, we could potentially call the Haunted back, something like our own Gemini Elf or Mystic Tomato, to potentially stop us from taking this damage, but I think it's ultimately fine. So we'll take that 1,900, and we draw Raigeki, which is pretty decent here. We have a couple options here. We could just fire the call, bring out like a Gemini Elf of our own, crash into theirs, and hit in with Yata to deprive them of cards in hand. The unfortunate thing with the Yata lock here is that they've got Sinister Serpent, which can potentially stop that Yata lock. If they set Serpent, then we're kind of out of luck. But we are just going to go for it anyways, force them to bring out the Serpent here. And we'll get back that Yata at the end phase. They're going to bring out a set monster, and Kaiku is actually really good here. If they did set the Serpent, then we can potentially call the Haunted back the Exiled Force, tribute off that to deal with their Serpent, then attack in with Kaiku to banish the Serpent from their graveyard, and then our Yata lock will be online. Our opponent will be able to draw a card next turn, but I do think it's worth doing. So we are indeed going to go for the Call of the Haunted here, tribute off that Exiled Force, and unfortunately we get majorly punished for this play, as their set was a Sangan here. So they'll be able to search their deck for a Fiber Jar, and that's kind of rough. I mean, the good thing is that we can still bring out this Kaiku and get in for a lot of damage, so our opponent will be at 1,200, and if they do set the Fiber Jar next turn, they do have a lot of cards that they won't be getting back, and a lot of powerful cards at that. So I do feel okay about this. Our opponent's going to set 2 and pass back to us. We draw Graceful Charity. We're just going to go for that. They've got Imperial Order. You know, that's fine. If their set is potentially a Fiber Jar, then, I mean, we'll be able to shuffle everything back anyways. And it is indeed the Fiber Jar. So everything will get shuffled back, but since we did not normal summon this turn, we can still bring out a monster next turn, protect ourselves. So I feel ultimately pretty fine about this. Our opponent is going to add back 5 cards to hand, replenishing themselves, but we do have the initiative here, so I do think that we're in not a terrible position, and it really does just depend on the draws we get, but I do feel like we're ultimately okay. But let's see what we actually get, because that will determine a lot. Oh, those Tomb Time Seal aren't the best right now, but they're also not the worst. I think what we actually want to do here is we just set the Tomato, and then set 1 Time Seal, pass back to them. We set only one time seal to play around something like Harpy's Feather Duster. So yeah, they're going to go for a Graceful Charity, which is a bit unfortunate here. They'll be able to draw 3, discard 2. They're going to discard a Tomato and a Bazoo, fire Raigeki on our Tomato, and they're going to bring out a Kaiku, which is quite annoying. They'll be able to attack in for 1800 and banish that Tomato from our graveyard. They're going to go for a Monster Reborn and bring back a Tomato. They could have gone for... No, they couldn't have gone for lethal damage here. But they could have gotten in a lot of damage. I mean, if they brought back the Bazoo, they could have gone for lethal. I guess they were playing around Mirror Force a bit. But as is, that makes our Raigeki all the more juicy. We're going to bring in this White Magical Hat and attack in. I felt pretty bad here because I realized that if I had set the White Magical Hat instead of the Tomato, I could have gone for lethal this turn. Unfortunately, they've got a Mirror Force either way, so it won't really matter there. They're going to then fire Scapegoat in the battle phase, which is an interesting choice because they already used a Mirror Force here. But, I mean, we'll just let them do it. We're going to fire a Time Seal, set a Call of the Haunted, and hope that this is enough. We're also going to set another Time Seal to draw lock them another turn. So I feel okay about this, but unfortunately they do have a Cannon Soldier as the last card in hand, so that will indeed be the end of the game. So I do think that we were in a pretty good position at the end of the game. If they didn't have Cannon Soldier exactly, I feel like we probably would have won. But yeah, that's just how it goes sometimes. And, you know, I do think it does show a flaw in this deck. Things like Time Seal can be really tough at actually, you know, getting you out of a tough situation. And, you know, while it did come up there as we did manage to draw lock them for one turn, it ultimately wasn't enough to stave off defeat there. So I do think that, you know, the Time Seals and the drop-offs are nice, but ultimately you can wind up in situations where they're pretty bad for you. So let's hope we don't get any more of those in the future games, and let's see if we can actually show off what this deck can do a little bit more. We're going to go first here. I don't really think I sided anything differently here, as I'm still experimenting with the deck, and I feel like it is still good for going first, as it is in its current iteration. We're just going to set a Witch of the Black Forest, set a drop off and a Time Seal. This turn we can drop off them, and we do indeed do that, and we hit a Change of Heart, which is really nice. They're going to go for a Confiscation here, which is a bit unfortunate. They can hit the Charity out of our hand, which is rough, but I did like saving the Charity, as I didn't really feel like we needed it this turn, and I do like saving Charity for situations where you can actually sort of preserve what cards you need to use against your opponent, as opposed to just, you know, trying to blind guess what your opponent's board is going to look like on the following turn. So unfortunately, they will indeed take that Charity. And I think that was probably the correct choice. They're going to fire a Charity of their own, which is really rough here. They're going to discard 2 tomatoes. They're going to go for a Pot of Greed. Wow. They are going all into their deck. They're going to fire a Raigeki and set a monster here. We do still get our Witch Search. We're going to look through the deck. We're actually going to grab a White Magical Hat as we can get in and discard their hand. We've got a Time Seal to potentially draw block them for one more turn. If they don't have any way to deal with it beyond that, then we feel pretty good. We're going to Raigeki their set. It was a Mystic Tomato. We're going to bring out a White Magical Hat and attack in. The reason we did it in this order is if they've got Imperial Order, we don't have any way to stop that. So we do want to know that the Raigeki goes through before committing the White Magical Hat to board. If they had a Torrential, that would obviously be really bad for us. But trading a White Magical Hat for Torrential is not the worst thing in the world. They've got a Mirror Force, though, so that will still trade with the White Magical Hat. We're going to fire a Time Seal, and they're just going to bring out a Mystic Tomato, get in for 1400. We feel really good about this because we can just summon out our Tomato, attack into their Cannon Soldier, and then bring out another monster here. We're going to bring out a Sangan. We could have brought out a Mystic Tomato, but I feel like Sangan is fine. If they've got some for removal, we get another monster to hand, and we could potentially even search Yata to draw lock them, as we are getting close to that situation. They're going to go for a Monster Reborn, and they're actually going to bring out a Mystic Tomato of their own, and they're going to tribute that off for Jinzo, which is kind of rough for us. Luckily, we've got Bazoo, which will be able to deal with the Jinzo. And we are actually going to search out Yata Garasu, as we are very close to the draw lock here. This turn we draw Change of Heart, which is insane, and now I think we've just won the game, because we can bring up Bazoo, hit over Jinzo. If they draw a flip monster to potentially get them out of it, we've got Change of Heart. If they draw a spell or trap card to potentially set and get them out of it, we've got Mystical Space Typhoon here. So I feel like we're pretty good here. We're going to bring up Bazoo, and we're going to banish 3 and hit over that Jinzo here. That will cost them 100 life points. We'll pass back to them. They draw 1 card, their last pathetic card, and they're just going to pass back to us, which I feel like is... Oh, wow. Duo is even better here. We're going to go for Duo, discard that last card from their hand. It's a Gemini Elf, and we bring out Yata Garasu, and that will just be the end of the game here. as, you know, we just bring a Yata every turn after this, and they've got no way to stop us. So we actually did manage to pull off the Yata lock, and I do think that the hand disruption traps were a big part of that. So I think that game shows what this deck can do when everything goes right for it. And when everything goes right for it, it can be very, very strong, as that game did hopefully show. But going from game 2 to game 3, we actually do make some changes to the deck. I actually side out the Magician of Faith and bring in some Nobleman of Crossout, as I do think Magician of Faith is somewhat slow, and going second Nobleman of Crossout can be very, very good at dealing with our opponent's set monsters. So I do that. Let's see if it actually comes up in these games. But yeah, this is a very good opener here. Wow. Our opponent's going to start with a Pot of Greed here, and they're going to set 3 and pass. We feel pretty good about that. We are going to start with a Forceful Sentry here just to see what they're working with, see if we need to go for the painful choice just yet. And we see that they've got a pretty decent hand here. Wow. They've got a Kaiku, a Dark Hole, a Fiber Jar, and a Cyber Jar. I think what I actually want to do here is take away the Kaiku. And the reason for this is that they'll have to set the Cyber Jar or Fiber Jar, which means that they can't get aggressive with it. And if they do set one of them, we can potentially sort of just attack into it, reset the board, and sort of go from there. So I'm not too worried about that. The Dark Hole is annoying, but we've got Imperial Order if we really do want to use it. So yeah, I think I'm going to take the Kaiku here. And our opponent said it's still a painful choice, and that's very funny knowing that we've got painful choice in hand. Also, we can always painful choice something to hand that can deal with whatever they have set. We're going to bring out a Mystic Tomato and attack and just try and bait out some back row here. Our opponent does have the Mirror Force that will deal with that. We're going to set 3 because we've got Imperial Order to deal with Harpy's Feather Duster. And we're just going to pass back to them. In draw phase, we are going to drop off their card that they just drew. Very glad we did that, as that was a tomato, which would be annoying to deal with. They're going to go for this Call of the Haunted here and bring back the Mystic Tomato. And that's fine by us, honestly. We know it's in their hands, so they can't like tribute off the tomato for a Jinzo or something. So we may as well wait until the battle phase in case our opponent does try to like blind snipe some of our back row with like a Mystical Space Typhoon or something. So in battle phase, they're going to attack in. We are just going to clear the Call of the Haunted with the Mystical Space Typhoon here. They're going to set 1, which I believe we do know is the Dark Hole. Yeah, it has to be the Dark Hole. So we're going to bring out this Bazoo here, and we're going to banish 3. We're then going to attack in for 2,500 here, and yeah, that will go through. We're going to pass back to them, and they are going to just set... Oh, wait. They're going to fire Dark Hole first. And we could potentially Imperial Order this, but I'm honestly not too worried about that, especially given that, you know, they're going to be setting a Cyber Jar or a Fiber Jar next turn. So I feel like we can let this go through. I mean, we could also... Yeah. So basically, the reason I want to do this is preserve Imperial Order for something else. But maybe I should have just fired the Imperial Order here instead of trying to get too clever with it. But yeah, they go for the Dark Hole, clear the Bazoo, and we're just going to fire Painful Choice, getting 5 cards that can actually deal with their sets. So we're going to send 2 Noblemen of Crossout, the Exiled Force, a Raigeki, and a Dark Hole here. We figure that, you know, we might as well go all in on this, as it's likely that they set the Cyber Jar instead of the Fiber Jar, and we are indeed correct here. So if the Fiber Jar goes off next turn, then this is fine. They're going to go for a Harpy's Feather Duster, and that will force out the Imperial Order here. They're going to summon out a Mystic Tomato and attack in for 1,400. The Imperial Order will just let that lapse because we draw Pot of Greed, which is insanely good. We'll draw 2, and we've got Confiscation to deal with that Fiber Jar, and we will indeed do that. Clearing that Fiber Jar there. We'll fire a Mystical Space Typhoon on their set, just in case they Mystical Space Typhoon of their own, because we really do need our Call of the Haunted to go through next turn. And they've got a Witch of the Black Forest. They'll attack in, or at least attempt to attack in, for 2,500. And we're going to think about this because we might want to save the Call of the Haunted to bring back Exiled Forest to pop their tomato. But I think given that they've got Witch in play now, and they're already gone 1 tomato, I feel like we can feel safe Call the Haunting back like a Bazoo. And just blocking this damage that we take. They'll pass back to us. We've got this Kaiku in hand, which makes this even better. We're going to banish 3 here, buffing Bazoo up to 2,500. We'll summon out this Kaiku, and we're actually going to attack into the Mystic Tomatoes first. I mean, the Witch would be more damage, but I want to get these cards out of their deck here because they're very annoying to deal with. Maybe I should have just hit the Witch, though. But yeah, I mean, hitting Witch also gives them instant access to, like, Gemini Elf. Or Kaiku of their own, so I feel like this is fine. And they're going to bring out a Sangan here, which is very predictable. They're going to bring out a Kaiku of their own anyways and hit into our Kaiku, crashing and clearing the board there. And they're just going to pass back to us. We draw Sangan, which is pretty nice. We can clear their board here. Maybe we shouldn't have cleared their board. Maybe we should have just set the Sangan. But I feel fine getting aggressive here, as we do have a pretty good aggressive board set up. They've also gone through one dark hole already. So I'm not most worried about a Raigeki. I mean, if they've got Raigeki, they've got Raigeki, but we've got Sangan here. And, you know, if they do fire Raigeki, we do get a card with Sangan. So I feel ultimately fine about this. And, you know, in the end phase, we're actually just going to buff up our Bazoo by 2 in case they draw something like a Gemini Elf. We could potentially even buff it up by 3. But if they draw like a Snatch Steal or something, that would be pretty bad for us. So I think this is fine. They're going to go for a painful choice here, and this might indeed be a very painful choice. They're going to send Raigeki, Graceful, Snatch Steal, Monster Reborn, and Kaiku. And that Morphing Jar is a bit of a mistake. They didn't mean to send it. But yeah, I mean, that would have been the best pick if they did actually send it. But as is, they've got a pretty painful selection of cards for us to deal with. We could potentially give them the Graceful here, as, you know, there aren't too many cards left in their deck that actually deals with this board, like, super, super well, especially given that they sent the Raigeki, Snatch Steal, and Monster Reborn. But I don't think I want to give them those cards. I think, honestly, we might give them the Raigeki here, as Raigeki does, you know, clear a board, but we do get a search off Sangan. That might be the best choice. We definitely don't want to give them the Monster Reborn, as that can deal with our board pretty well and also get them back like a Kaiku. We don't want to give them the Kaiku if that deals with Bazoo. We don't want to give them the Snatch Steals. That would be very powerful. So yeah, I think the choice between Raigeki and Graceful, and I think I do just want to give them the Raigeki. Maybe in hindsight, this was not the best choice. Maybe I should have just given them the Graceful, because they are really low on power cards here. So I feel like Graceful wouldn't necessarily draw them anything too good, but as is, we give them the Raigeki. We get a search off the Sangan. We're going to think about exactly what to search. We know that they've got Exiled Force and Fairy Lily here, and so we're just going to search out a Witch, which can potentially hit over the Injection Fairy Lily if they bring it out, and they didn't need bring it out. And yeah, it also plays pretty well into a Exiled Force, because if we bring out Tomato here, then they could just let the Injection Fairy Lily attack go through, and without like pumping for damage, and then they could bring out an Exiled Force on the following turn to pop our Tomato. So I feel like Witch is the best play here. We draw Time Seal, which is very good, but again, you know, just like I mentioned in deck building, it isn't the best here, as, you know, we can only really use it to stop our opponent's next play, which if they draw something good might be bad for us. So they do indeed draw that card, which is unfortunate, and it is a Gemini Elf, which is kind of rough, especially given that we don't actually have any Bazoos left in deck, since we are only playing V1. We're going to add a Gemini Elf to hand here, and they are just going to let that go through and pass back to us, and we're in a really tough spot. Drop off is okay, but I think what I need to do here is just attack in with Gemini Elf and crash, and our opponent will be able to bring an Exiled Force here next turn, which is very unfortunate, but not much we can do there. We're going to fire a Time Seal now, and I think maybe this was a bit of a misplay, as maybe we should have gone for the drop-off instead, given that, you know, if they draw a Serpent, then they'll get back the Serpent on the turn after they bring out Exiled, and what we really need to win is for them to summon out Exiled, and then for us to attack over it with something, with a monster, and then not get chump blocked later. So I think maybe I should have saved Time Seal for later, drop off to this turn. If it is Serpent, then I'd at least know that they'd have a Serpent, and they wouldn't be able to use that to chump block as much, but I think it's a very minor misplay here, and it may not even come up. They're going to attack in for 1,000 with Exiled Force, and luckily we do draw a monster. If we didn't draw a monster here, we would just be like mega dead, but luckily we draw a monster. We are just going to summon out that monster, attack into Exiled Force, deal 400. And if they don't draw Serpent this turn, then we just win the game. So they're going to draw, we fire Drop Off, and that is a Mystical Space Typhoon, unfortunately for them. So that will indeed be the end of the game, and we won that one by the skin of our teeth. But I do think it does show sort of the strengths and weakness of our deck very well. The drop-offs and time seals can be extremely powerful if you're able to lock down your opponent's resources and then bring out something like Yata. And there are a lot of things in this format that can actually deal very well with your opponent's cards that they bring out. So you can sort of pick apart your opponent's resource that they have while also picking apart the cards they draw, and then eventually go for a Yata push. And that is like somewhat consistent. However, if you are in a tough spot, then the drop-offs and time seals are really bad to draw. And also things like White Magical Hat are really tough to draw as well. I think, honestly, in the future, I might even cut the White Magical Hat, as it plays really badly into Sinister Serpent. And, you know, it's just very underwhelming as a monster in its own right. Maybe in the future, we'll also experiment with adding like a Robin Goblin. Robin Goblin could potentially be good, and can play very well with some of the various monsters in this format. However, I do like the current build of the deck as it is as a first test run. There are some things that I would definitely change in the future, but I do think this sort of is a proof of concept that this sort of hand disruption deck can work going all in on the hand disruption and maybe even be tier 1. I think in past formats, this deck was kind of below tier 1 as, you know, it had time seals, it had White Magical Hat, but as I mentioned here, White Magical Hat is a very underwhelming monster, and time seal does have some major flaws to it. But adding 3 more copies of time seal in the form of drop off can potentially make this deck a lot better, and having the Yata to lock the game down after you've drop offed and time sealed your opponent is what this deck really needed. But I'm curious what you all think of this deck. Let me know down in the comments below. And if you want to see more videos like this in fiber format, definitely subscribe. That's the best way to keep updated on these videos as they come out. And also, if you're interested in playing, join the YGO from Zero Discord server. Link in the description down below. We hold, tournaments every week, very small tournaments every week. But we also do hold monthly tournaments, which are generally a bit bigger. This month's tournament is kind of potentially delayed, depending on whether Dueling Book can actually fix an exploit that makes tournament play really tough on it. But I'll keep you all posted with that as more news arises. But if you do want to play fiber format, that's one of the best places to do it. Anyways, I hope that you enjoyed this video as always. And until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.